I just finished watching the movie GoldenEye.
You were expecting someone else?
It's hard for me to believe that this movie is almost 30 years old now. It came out in 1995. It's currently 2025.
What year is it?
I remember seeing this movie in the theater when I was a teenager. I loved the Bond movies. I watched them all on VHS, and this was my first opportunity to watch one of those movies in the theater. And I remember clearly coming out of the movie theater just completely blown away. I thought it was amazing. It reinforced my love of this franchise, and I've been a super fan of James Bond movies ever since. GoldenEye came out in a unique time. The Cold War had just ended. Bond movies hadn't been around for a while. There was a hunger for the franchise. Fans thought that Timothy Dalton was really super serious. Roger Moore is really super goofy. Sean Connery set the tone. How is this new James Bond going to live up? And I have to say that even now, 30 years later, he absolutely nails the role of James Bond. It's like this guy was made in a lab specifically to be James Bond.
This never happened to the other fella.
He has the look, he has the voice, he has the charisma, he has the acting chops, and he looks great in a tuxedo. He's handsome without trying to be, and he's completely believable as an action hero. 100% perfect casting of this guy as James Bond. The movie, in a good way, is a product of its time. It's just past the end of the Cold War, so this movie has to sort of reestablish Bond in the new, modern, post-Soviet era. A lot of the Bond movies were anti-communist movies or Cold War era movies, so it makes sense that the opening sequence would be a flashback during the latter years of the Soviet Union. And I have to say, this opening sequence is one of the best in any Bond movie. Bond movies are really good at the action-packed opening sequence prologue, and this movie has one of the best. You don't see Bond's face initially, and that's kind of a, I think, intentional thing because this is a new James Bond, and they kind of want to save the reveal. So you see the back of his head, close-ups of his feet running. He does this amazing stunt. I doubt it was Pierce Brosnan who actually jumped off of the dam, but it's a really great stunt. It looks amazing on film, and it sets the tone as an action Bond movie that really is trying to push it to the next level.
Beg your pardon? Forgot to knock.
Bond meets up with 006, and it's really interesting to see two 00 agents working side by side. I don't recall that ever happening in any of the previous Bond movies. And the actor who plays 006, really charismatic, really believable as a James Bond, companion. He could have almost been cast as James Bond himself, and it would have been okay. He looks like he could have been a James Bond, so it's natural that he is 006 hanging out with 007. Great action sequence. It establishes things that will be important later in the movie. It shows this old Soviet general who will be one of the main antagonists later in the film. We get the supposed execution of 006, which obviously comes into play later. And then Bond manages to escape using wit and bravado and quick thinking and action and shooting machine guns and having hero armor where no matter how many times he's shot at, he doesn't get hit. The chase sequence involving the motorcycle and the airplane is a little over the top, even for a Bond movie. There's no way that he's going to catch up to the falling airplane, but whatever. It's fun. It's forgivable. It's great. And then we get to Tina Turner's James Bond theme song, GoldenEye. This is at the top tier of James Bond movie songs. I love Skyfall with Adele. I love Paul McCartney's Live and Let Die. This is one of the best of all of the James Bond movies. Iconic. It feels like a James Bond song. You know it's a James Bond song. It has the iconic da-na.
GoldenEye, no time for sweetness.
And it has its own spin to it as well, and she's a great singer. And then, of course, you get lots of action sequences. I'm not going to go point by point to the movie. We've all seen it. If you haven't seen it, I don't know why you're watching this right now. But it does all of the James Bond stuff just in the right, mixture. Some Bond movies go a little over the top. They're too silly. They're too ridiculous. They become self-parody. This movie has some fun elements, but it doesn't go too far. It's not too serious. This is coming right after License to Kill. You can watch my review of License to Kill. I think License to Kill was great, but it was very serious, very dark. This lightens the mood, but still seems like a serious movie. It tones down the campiness of the Roger Moore era. It goes back to the more Sean Connery-esque formula, but Pierce Brosnan is sort of like an amalgamation of all of the Bonds that came before him, and he's just absolutely perfect in this role. You instantly know he's James Bond just by looking at him. The movie does some globe-trotting, which is fun. You get to see Russia, you get to see Cuba, and James Bond riding a tank through the streets of St. Petersburg is one of the best sequences, and we get the Bond theme music rip-roaring full throttle there. And the Bond movie has its cliches, too. There's the easily escapable traps that are set for James Bond instead of killing him outright. They strap him into a helicopter that's about to explode. They lock him in a train that's about to blow up. Very much lampooned by Austin Powers. It really is that. But hey, it is a James Bond movie, so you are going to have the over-the-top silliness. The bad guys aren't going to kill James Bond straight out, and they are going to monologue. They are going to explain the plot a little bit. In one of the best sequences of the movie, 007 goes to a place where they have all the old statues from the fallen Soviet Union. And that's where he meets his old companion, 006, who turns out that he really has a grudge against the British government, and he's not really the good guy after all. Not a surprise to anyone that's ever seen a movie before, but, you know, it's a good reveal all the same.
Closing time, James. Last call.
And the dialogue between the good guys and the bad guys is actually very smartly written. The dialogue overall is very smartly written. When we get introduced to the new M, she's a fantastic character, instantly believable. And they address the sexism of the Bond franchise head on. She calls him a misogynistic dinosaur, which I think is fantastic, but it doesn't diminish Bond and it doesn't take away what he does in the movie. It just establishes that this new M character is an ass-kicking boss, different from the previous boss, but still an ass-kicking boss. And the charisma between these two, they are gold together when they're on film. Absolutely brilliant casting to put Judi Dench in the movie. Moneypenny is believable as Moneypenny. It's great to have Desmond Llewellyn as Q, and that's one of the funniest sequences in the movie.
And what if I need additional support?
It's tested for 100.
A little bit of comic relief. The Q laboratory is fantastic. It has all of the elements that you want there to be. The witty dialogue. Desmond Llewellyn just nails it every single time. The bit with the phone booth where the guy gets stuck in the phone booth, and then with a bit of properly done comedic timing, you see the guy in the phone booth a little bit later.
Ready here to demonstrate for us. Here we are.
All very well done. The movie has a climax in Cuba, and one thing that I think is really neat that I appreciate is they reference the previous James Bond movie, License to Kill. It's the same airplane that James Bond helped capture in the beginning of License to Kill. The CIA guy makes a reference to a plane that they borrowed from their DEA friends.
Borrowed a plane from a friend of mine in the DEA. Now, the Coast Guard and the FAA are both in the loop.
And it's the same plane that James Bond captured in the previous movie. I think that's a nice little touch. And of course, Bond kills the bad guy, saves the day, gets the girl. It all wraps up nicely. And it just overall is just about the perfect James Bond movie. It has a little bit of the silly elements, has a little bit of the serious dramatic elements, has some gadgets that actually come into play and are used. The pen clicking thing was just fantastic. As you're trying to count the clicks to see if the pen grenade is going to go off or not, that builds tension, and that's a really well done scene. This whole movie is just put together surprisingly well. I can't really rank my favorite James Bond movies best to worst. There's bad ones, there's good ones, and then there's ones that excel. This is one of the James Bond movies that excels. It stands the test of time. It brings Bond into the modern era. Even though it's 30 years old, it still achieves its goal of bringing Bond into the modern era. I can't say enough good things about this movie. It's excellent. Also, it has one of the best video game tie-ins of all time. GoldenEye on Nintendo 64, probably, in my opinion, the best movie video game ever made. Let me know in the comments, what do you think? Do you think GoldenEye is top-tier James Bond like I do? Was the GoldenEye video game one of the best video games of all time? You can probably tell by the gray on my chin that I'm a Nintendo 64 guy. From that video game era, and maybe even a little bit earlier. But, you know, Nintendo 64 is when I was a teenager, so I played the crap out of that game. And the music, it's just stuck in my brain. When I hear the music in this movie, it's hard for me not to think of the video game. Those two things are sort of linked in my brain. But In any event, thank you for watching The Reaction Lounge with Eric Wilfred Watson. If you want to see some action, read some action, you can check out my novels, Judas Kissed, Becoming Quincy, and Death Siren. Until next time.